The rifle was already in Ira Donnelly's hands when she turned around and looked at him with those eyes that made the whole world stop making sense. She did not flinch. She did not raise her hands. She simply stood in the middle of his yard, the morning sun cutting gold lines across the dust, a leather satchel hanging from one shoulder and a smile on her face that was either the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most reckless. "You are standing on private land," Ira said, his voice low and hard as the iron rail of a cattle fence, "and you have about 10 seconds to explain yourself before I decide what to do about it." The woman tilted her head. The smile did not leave. "My name is Jennie Dawson," she said, as if that were an answer to anything at all. "And I believe you are Ira Donnelly, which means I am exactly where I am supposed to be." He had not lowered the rifle. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed against the light and against her, against the sheer impossible nerve of a woman standing in his yard with nothing but a satchel and a declaration. He had been alone on this land for 6 years. 6 years of deliberate, chosen solitude. 6 years of keeping the world at the end of a dirt road so long and rutted that most people gave up before they reached his gate. Yet here she was. "Nobody is supposed to be here," he said. "Your brother thought differently," she replied. The rifle lowered an inch. Not all the way, not even close to all the way, but an inch, and she noticed it the way perceptive people notice everything. And that was the moment everything changed. Not the moment she smiled, though that would haunt him later. Not the moment he finally lowered the rifle all the way and let the barrel point at the ground like an admission. The moment was right there, in the middle of that yard, with the chickens moving nervously around her boots and the morning heat already building up behind the hills, when she said his brother's name without being asked, and the air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with a weapon. But to understand why that name broke something open in Ira Donnelly, you have to go back. You have to go back 6 years, to the night the world as he knew it ended, and he rebuilt it here in the high desert of West Texas with walls made of silence and stone. It was the autumn of 1878 when Ira Donnelly arrived in the Pecos Valley and bought 400 acres of cracked, unforgiving land that no one else wanted. He was 28 years old, and he was running. Not from the law, not from debt, not from any of the things men usually ran from in those years when the frontier was still wild enough to swallow a man whole if he let it. He was running from grief so vast it had no edges, only depth. His wife, Clara, had died of fever in the spring of that year. They had been married for 3 years. They had been trying to have a child. The fever took her in 4 days, and it took everything he had ever understood about the future along with it. His younger brother, Caleb, had stood at the graveside and held Ira up when Ira's legs stopped working, and it was Caleb who had finally said, nearly a year later, that Ira needed to go somewhere new or the grief was going to finish what the fever started. Ira had gone to Texas. He had bought the land. He had built a house with his own hands, learned the cattle trade, hired 2 hands who asked no questions and kept their distance, and settled into the kind of life that required every hour of every day just to sustain itself. Work was a cure, not a complete one but something close enough to function. He did not go back to Missouri. He did not write letters. He did not invite anyone to visit. He sent money to Caleb when he had it, which was his version of keeping in touch, his version of saying he was still alive without having to say any of it out loud. He was not a cruel man. He was not even an antisocial one by nature. He was a man who had found that love, when it ended, left a wound that did not close the way ordinary wounds did. It festered instead. It got infected with all the moments he would never have, all the mornings he would wake up alone, all the children who would never exist. And so he had built a wall around it, not out of hardness for its own sake, but out of survival. 6 years of that. 6 years of the wall holding. And then Jennie Dawson showed up with a satchel and a smile. He did not ask her inside immediately. That would have been too much too fast, and even with the rifle at his side, Ira Donnelly was not a man who moved fast about anything. Instead, he stood in the yard and watched her, and she stood in the yard and let herself be watched. And after a long silence that would have made most people deeply uncomfortable, he said, "What did Caleb tell you?" "He told me you needed a housekeeper," she said. "He told me the ranch was in good order but the house was not. He told me you were proud and stubborn, and that you would probably point a gun at me, which I now know was an accurate prediction. And he told me the pay was fair and the work was honest." She paused. "He did not tell me you were quite so tall." Something moved in Ira's chest that he could not immediately identify because it had been so long since anything had moved in there. He thought it might have been something approaching exasperated amusement. He pressed it back down. "Caleb did not tell me he was sending anyone," Ira said. "I believe he knew you would say no. He was right." Ira looked at her more carefully now that the immediate shock of her presence had settled slightly. She was perhaps 25, though it was difficult to be certain. Her dark hair was pinned up but coming loose around her face in the way of someone who had traveled a long road. Her dress was plain, brown linen, practical and clean. She had brown eyes that were alert and direct in a way that was almost disconcerting. She looked like a woman who had dealt with a considerable amount of life already and had come out on the other side of it still standing. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "San Antonio," she said. "Stage to Fort Stockton, then a hired wagon to the turnoff on the Valley Road. The driver left me at the gate because his horses did not want to go further on that road, and I cannot say I blame them." "That is a remarkable stretch of rocks you have for a road, Mr. Donnelly. It discourages visitors," he said. "I noticed." She looked at the house behind him, then back at him. "Is there any chance of a glass of water? I have been walking for 2 hours and the sun out here has a personal quality to it." He almost said no. He almost told her to turn around and start walking back to the gate and that he would send word to Caleb that he appreciated the thought. Instead he heard himself say, "Around back. There is a pump at the well." She thanked him with a nod that was neither servile nor overly familiar, just direct and real, and she walked around the side of the house. He stood where he was for a moment, looking at the spot where she had been standing, and then he leaned the rifle against the porch railing and followed her. She was working the pump handle when he came around the corner, and she bent her head under the flow of water and drank without ceremony, and when she straightened up she wiped her face with her sleeve and looked at him with water drops still on her cheeks. "It is a good well," she said. "Deep," he confirmed. The silence between them was different now. Less hostile, not comfortable yet, not by a long way, but different. "I am not in the habit of turning away people who have walked 2 hours in the West Texas heat," Ira said finally, which was not entirely true but felt like the right thing to say in this particular moment. "You can stay the night, and we will figure out the rest of it in the morning." "That is fair," Jennie said. He showed her the small room off the back of the house that had been used for storage since he moved in. It had a window that looked east, and the accumulated clutter of 6 years of a man living alone without much care for domestic order. She looked at it without expression for a moment, then set her satchel down on the floor and began to move things with calm efficiency. "I will get you a cot," he said. "Thank you." He left her there and went out to the barn, and he stood with his forehead pressed against the rough wood of a post for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as he allowed himself to do anything that was not immediately productive. Then he found the cot, folded and dusty in the corner, and he carried it back to the house. Jennie Dawson had already cleared a significant portion of the room by the time he returned. She had stacked boxes neatly against the far wall and swept the floor with a broom she had found somewhere, and she was standing at the window looking out at the view when he came in. "You can see the canyon from here," she said. "Yes," he said. "Caleb told me about the canyon. He said you used to write to him about it when you first arrived." She turned from the window. "He said it was the one thing you mentioned in your letters that sounded like you were still capable of being surprised by the world." Ira set the cot down. He looked at her. "You and Caleb seem to have had a great many conversations." "We had 3, she said. "He came to the boarding house where I was working in San Antonio. He came back the next week with a letter of recommendation and a train and stage schedule. He came back the week after that with the wages for the first month in advance. She paused. He seemed very determined to help you. Caleb has always been determined, Ira said. The word had a complicated texture in his mouth. He loved his brother. He also knew that love did not entitle a person to rearrange another person's life without asking. Are you angry at him? Jennie asked with a directness that should have been presumptuous but somehow was not. Not yet, Ira said. She almost smiled at that. He noticed and looked away. He made supper that evening himself, as he always did, a plain meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread, and he set a second place at the table, which was the first time he had done that in longer than he could count. Jennie sat down across from him and ate without fuss, and she talked a little, not too much, about the road and the landscape and a hawk she had seen circling the canyon rim on her way up. He answered in single sentences. She did not seem to require more than that. After supper, she washed the dishes without being asked, and he went out to sit on the porch in the way he did every evening to watch the stars come out. A few minutes later, she came out and stood at the edge of the porch and looked up, and the stars over West Texas in the year 1884 were so dense and so close they looked like something a man might be able to reach if he only tried. I want you to know something, Jennie said quietly without looking at him. I am not here to impose on your life. Caleb told me enough that I understand you value your solitude. I am not interested in complicating things for you. I am interested in honest work and a place to be. Ira looked at her profile against the stars. Why did you leave San Antonio? A pause. A small one, but he caught it. The boarding house closed, she said. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had kept his own secrets for 6 years, that this was true but also incomplete. He let it go. A person was entitled to their own version of things, at least in the beginning. He had his, God knew. The work here is hard, he said. Not complicated but physically demanding. The altitude bothers some people, the isolation bothers others. I am not bothered by either of those things, she said. He believed her, though he did not know why. Then we will try it, he said. A month, see how it goes. That seems reasonable, she said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another hour, listening to the coyotes call across the canyon and feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of knowing that there was another person breathing in his house. It was not entirely uncomfortable, which alarmed him more than if it had been. The first week was a careful negotiation. Jennie Dawson turned out to be the kind of person who did not ask for guidance and did not require supervision. She moved through the house with systematic purpose, and by the third day she had reorganized the kitchen in a way that was dramatically more functional, and she had produced meals that were, frankly, significantly better than anything Ira had been feeding himself. She was also quiet in the mornings, which he appreciated deeply, because morning was when he did his thinking, and the house had always been where he thought. She went to bed when it was dark and rose before him, which he discovered on the fourth morning when he came into the kitchen to find coffee already made. The smell of it stopped him in the doorway in a way that was almost physical. It was such a simple thing. Coffee already made. He could not explain why it hit him the way it did, somewhere below the ribs in a place he had been keeping locked. He did not speak of it. He poured his cup and went out to start the day. His 2 ranch hands, older men named Devlin and Soto, took note of the development with the particular careful blankness of men who know better than to comment on their employer's personal arrangements. Devlin did ask, on the second day, in a tone of studied casualness, who the lady was. Ira told him she was the new housekeeper, sent by his brother. Devlin nodded as if this were a perfectly ordinary piece of information. Soto never asked anything at all, which was his particular gift. It was at the end of the first week that Jennie's secret began to surface. Not all at once. Secrets in the West Texas desert came out the way water came out of dry ground after rain, slowly, at first just a darker patch of earth, then a trickle, then suddenly more than you had prepared for. On the 7th day, a rider came up the road. Ira saw him from the barn. A man on a gray horse moving with the deliberate purpose of someone who knew where he was going and had decided on his speed before he left. He was dressed well for this country, too well, a dark coat and a hat that was expensive. Ira walked out of the barn and watched him approach with the same settled wariness he brought to most things. The man pulled up at the yard and looked around without dismounting, the way a man looks at property he is assessing. "I am looking for a woman named Jennie Dawson," he said. His accent was flat, Midwestern, and his eyes were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Not many people find their way up this road by accident," Ira said. "Who are you?" "My name is Harlan Webb," the man said. "I am an attorney from Abilene. I have business with Miss Dawson." "What kind of business?" Harlan Webb's gaze shifted to him with the calculated patience of a man who was accustomed to other men moving out of his way. "The private kind," he said. Ira stood where he was. "Then I suggest you go back to Abilene and conduct it by letter." Webb looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across his face, carefully controlled, that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. "She is here, then?" It was not a question. Ira said nothing. "Tell her," Webb said slowly, "that the matter we discussed is not resolved. Tell her that patience has its limits." He gathered his reins. "I will be in Pecos for 2 weeks. After that I stop being patient." He rode back down the road at the same deliberate pace. Ira watched until the dust settled, then turned toward the house. Jennie was in the doorway, she had heard. He could see it in the rigidity of her posture and the way the color had left her face, though she was holding herself very still with a composure that he recognized as something a person had to practice extensively before they had it. "Come inside," she said before he could speak. He followed her in. She sat at the table. He sat across from it and waited, because that was what you did when someone was gathering themselves to tell you something they had not intended to tell you yet. "I owe you the truth," she said. "I am sorry I did not offer it before now." "Go ahead," he said. She folded her hands on the table. "My father died 8 months ago. He was a merchant in San Antonio, a reasonably successful one. When he died, it became apparent that he had borrowed a substantial sum of money from Harlan Webb over the previous 2 years, against the house and the business. The debt was larger than the estate. Webb took the business and the house. He also, in the process of reviewing my father's papers, found out that my father had a partial share in a land grant in the Pecos Valley. A grant that is in my name, because my father registered it for me when I was 16 as a form of inheritance." She met his eyes. "Webb wants the grant. He has been pressuring me to sign it over to him since my father's death. I have refused. When the boarding house closed, I had to leave my lodging, and Caleb Donnelly was a friend of my father's, and when I told him my situation, he suggested I come here, far enough from Abilene that Webb would have difficulty." Ira absorbed this steadily. "How large is the grant?" 300 acres, in the lower valley, perhaps 8 miles from here. "Is it good land?" "I believe so. My father always spoke of it as something I could build on someday." Her voice was level, but underneath it there was something that was not quite sadness and not quite fear, something more like the quiet determination of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time. "Does Webb have a legal claim?" Ira asked. "His attorney argues that the land should be considered part of my father's estate and therefore subject to the debt. My father's original registration lists only my name. I have the document." She reached into her satchel and drew out a folded paper, worn at the edges. "The law in Texas on this is not entirely clear, particularly for a woman, which is why I have been stalling while I try to determine what my options are." Ira looked at the document without taking it from her hands. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, and the windmill at the well made its slow, creaking turn. "Webb is not the kind of man who accepts being stalled for long," he said. "No," she agreed. "He is not." Ira stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the land, his land, the land he had built out of grief and stubbornness and 6 years of hard work. He thought about what it meant to have land. What it meant to have something taken from you that should have been yours. He turned around. I know a man in Pecos who is a lawyer, honest, which in Pecos is rare enough to be notable. His name is Fletcher. I will ride in tomorrow and ask him to look at your document." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "Why?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not an accusatory one. "Because you are on my land," he said, "and Webb rode up my road uninvited and spoke to me in the way that men speak when they are used to getting what they want and not caring about the rest of it. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. I do not like that kind of man." He went back out to the barn and did not say anything more about it that evening, but something had shifted. He felt it the way you feel a change in the weather before you can see it, a pressure difference, a new quality to the air. He had spent 6 years in deliberate isolation, and the wall was still standing, but Jennie Dawson and her leather satchel and her land grant and her careful composure had arrived at a gate in it he had not known was there. The ride to Pecos took most of the next day. The town in 1884 was rough and busy, the kind of place that happened when cattle routes and railroad ambitions collided with the high desert, full of men doing business in ways that ranged from strictly legal to something considerably more creative. Ira did not come in often, and when he did he kept his business efficient and his conversations short. Fletcher's office was above the hardware store. The man himself was thin and dry as mesquite, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a mind that Ira had found, on the one previous occasion he had used him, to be formidably precise. Ira laid out the situation plainly. Fletcher listened without interrupting, then examined the land grant document for a long time. Her father registered this in her name before Texas's current community property statutes fully crystallized in their application, Fletcher said at last. That works in her favor. The document is properly recorded with the county. Webb's argument that it forms part of the estate is thin, but he has money and thin arguments sometimes win when the opposition cannot afford to press back. He looked over his glasses. "What is her financial situation?" "Limited," Ira said. Fletcher set the document down. "Tell her to come see me. Bring the original. I will send a formal letter to Webb's attorney establishing that the land is hers by prior separate registration and threatening legal action if he continues to harass her. That may be enough to make him decide the fight is not worth it. If it is not, we will need to take it further." Ira thanked him, paid the consultation fee from his own pocket, and rode back to the ranch. He told Jennie what Fletcher had said. She listened quietly, and when he finished she asked how much the consultation had cost. He told her not to worry about it. She looked at him with an expression that walked the fine line between gratitude and pride. "I will repay you," she said. "We will settle accounts at the end of the month," he said, "like any other arrangement." She accepted this, though he could see she was not entirely comfortable with it. She had the particular dignity of someone who had been raised to manage their own affairs and found accepting help from others a complicated exercise. The days began to have a rhythm. Ira left early and came back at midday for the meal Jennie had made, and they ate together in a silence that gradually, almost imperceptibly, became less a silence of two strangers and more a silence of two people who were growing used to each other. She asked questions about the cattle, practical questions, and he answered them. He asked questions about San Antonio, and she answered those. They moved around the knowledge of Harlan Webb, and what he represented, like people moving carefully around something that had not been diffused yet. On a Wednesday in the 3rd week, she came out to the corral where he was working with a young horse and stood at the fence rail and watched without speaking. He was aware of her in the way he had become aware of all things concerning her, with a peripheral alertness that he could not entirely account for. After a while she said, "You are very good with horses." "Practice," he said. "The horse does not seem afraid of you," she observed. "Some horses are afraid of everything. But this one is watching you the way animals watch when they have decided something is safe." He glanced at her. The afternoon light was full on her face, and she was looking at the horse with something warm and unguarded in her expression that he had not seen before. "Were you around animals growing up?" he asked. "My father had a pair of mules," she said. "I used to feed them when I was small. They were more patient than most people I knew." A smile crossed her face, brief and genuine, and something deeper than pleasant. A smile that belonged to an actual memory, to a person who had once been a child in a world that still felt manageable. Something tightened in Ira's chest. He turned back to the horse and spent the next several minutes doing very deliberate work that had nothing to do with feelings. Fletcher's letter reached Webb's attorney within the fortnight. The reply, which Fletcher forwarded to Ira with a covering note, was what Fletcher described as aggressive bluster, the language of a man who was accustomed to intimidation, but had now encountered a formal legal structure that made his position more complicated. Fletcher recommended they stand firm, and said he believed Webb would eventually calculate that the legal costs of pursuing the claim outweighed the land's value to him. This was rational. It was also, Ira knew, not a guarantee. Men like Harlan Webb did not always make rational calculations, especially when their pride was involved. And Webb had the look of a man for whom being told no by a woman was its own particular provocation. He did not share all of his concern with Jennie. He shared enough to keep her informed and held the rest back, which was perhaps paternalistic, but which he did genuinely feel was better than alarming her beyond what was currently necessary. She knew he was holding something back. He knew she knew. They did not discuss it, which was itself a kind of intimacy, knowing where the other person's edges were. The 5th week of Jennie Dawson's time on the ranch brought rain, which was rare enough in the Pecos Valley to be genuinely remarkable. It came in the afternoon, a proper storm that swept down from the Guadalupe Mountains with the full theatrical weight of a West Texas sky that had decided to make a point. Lightning over the canyon, thunder that rolled through the valley and bounced back from the rock walls, and rained so hard for about 20 minutes that it turned the yard to red mud and sent sheets of water pouring from the barn roof. Ira was in the barn when it hit, and he stayed there working by lantern light while the storm did what it needed to do. After an hour, the rain settled into a steady, softer fall, and he crossed the yard through the mud and came into the house and found Jennie sitting at the table with a lamp and a book. She looked up. He was soaked. He had mud to his knees. "There are dry clothes on the hook by the fireplace," she said. "I moved them there when I saw the storm coming." He looked at the clothes. He looked at her. He looked at the fire she had built in the fireplace, which he almost never used. "Thank you," he said. He changed by the fire, which was intimate in a way he had not been prepared for, the warmth of it and the fact that she had thought to do it, the small and practical and human act of anticipating what another person would need. He sat down at the table with a mug of coffee she set in front of him and listened to the rain on the roof and felt, for the first time in 6 years, something very close to the word he refused to think directly. "Do you miss having people around?" she asked. It was a direct question, but her tone was careful, genuinely curious rather than probing. He thought about it honestly, which was something he was not in the habit of doing. "I did not think so," he said. "For a long time I thought I had arranged things correctly. And now," the fire crackled, the rain said everything the silence needed to fill. "I am still thinking about it," he said. She accepted that without pushing, which made him want to tell her more than he had intended to. "I was married," he said. "Her name was Clara. She died in 1878. That is why I came here." Jennie was very still. "I am sorry," she said, and the 2 words were quiet and clean and did not try to do more than they could do. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was what people said and was both true and completely insufficient. "Grief does not operate on schedule," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It does not. I lost my mother when I was 13, she said after a moment. "Then my father last year. The second one is different. The first one teaches you that loss is possible. The second one teaches you that it keeps being possible forever, and there is nothing you can do to prevent it." He did not know why that made him feel less alone than he had in 6 years. It just did. They sat by the fire for another hour, talking about small things, the the ranch and the land and the history of the valley, and then about larger things that crept in through the sides of the conversation without anyone inviting them, about what a person wanted a life to look like, about whether it was possible to rebuild after you had lost the thing you built toward. He had not talked this way since Caleb, and Caleb was his brother, which meant a different kind of latitude than this. When the fire burned low, she said good night and went to her room, and he sat in the chair for a long time after, listening to the last of the rain and trying to identify what was happening inside him with the same calm assessment he brought to everything else. He could not do it. The territory was too unfamiliar. The following Sunday he rode down to the lower valley on the pretense of checking the south fence line, which did need checking, but also of looking at the 300 acres of Jennie's land grant. He had seen it from a distance before but never ridden across it. It was good land, he realized, better than it looked from the road. The soil near the creek bed was dark and promising. The grass was sparse, but there was water access, which was everything out here. With work, which was always the answer, it could be made into something. He rode back thinking about what it would take. 2 days later, a man arrived at the gate who was not Harlan Webb but whom Ira recognized as the type that worked for men like Harlan Webb. He was younger, harder looking, and he sat his horse with the loose ease of someone who was comfortable with his capacity for violence. He did not come all the way up the road. He stopped at the gate and looked at the ranch for several minutes, then rode back the way he had come. Devlin saw it from the north field and reported it to Ira at the end of the day. Ira's jaw tightened, and he spent the evening making several decisions. He wrote a letter to Fletcher outlining the visitation and asking whether it constituted any kind of actionable threat. He also wrote a letter to Caleb, which was the first letter he had written in 2 years, telling him about Jennie's situation and asking if Caleb had any contacts in Abilene who could learn more about Webb's history. And then he went and knocked on the door of Jennie's room, which he had never done before. She opened it after a moment, still dressed but with her hair down, and she looked at him steadily. "We need to talk about Webb," he said. She listened while he told her about the rider at the gate. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something in her eyes went very quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they are deciding how afraid they are allowed to be. "He is sending someone to watch the place," she said. "Yes, because he knows I am here." "Yes." Ira leaned against the doorframe. "You need to know this is becoming more than a legal matter." "I know," she said. She turned and looked out the window at the dark. "I was hoping Fletcher's letter would discourage him. It may have made him angrier." She was silent for a moment. "I can leave," she said. Her voice was even, but the offer cost something. He could hear what was underneath it, the fear and the pride and the terrible practicality of a woman who had been making difficult calculations for most of a year. "No," he said. The word came out with more force than he intended. He moderated it. "That is not necessary, and it would not solve anything because he would follow you. The land is the issue, not your location." She turned back to look at him. In the lamplight, her face was very clear. All the armor she usually wore set slightly aside by the lateness and the worry, and he was struck again by something he had been trying not to be struck by for 5 weeks. "Then, what do we do?" she asked. "We get ahead of him," Ira said. "I'm going to Pecos the day after tomorrow. I want you to come with me to speak to Fletcher directly and formalize everything. A sworn declaration of ownership, documentation of Webb's harassment. We put it all in the official record, which makes it much harder for him to operate in the shadows." She nodded. "All right. And in the meantime," he said, "I will be sleeping with the rifle where I can reach it." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not entirely categorize. It was not quite gratitude. It was something more complicated than that, something that asked a question she did not put into words. "Thank you, Ira," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He said good night and went back to his room and lay awake for a considerable portion of the night, and it was not entirely because of Harlan Webb. The trip to Pecos was undertaken in the ranch wagon, which was more practical than riding for a full day's journey. Jennie sat on the bench beside him, and the landscape opened up around them in the grand and indifferent way of the West Texas desert, all red rock and wide sky, and the distant blue suggestion of mountains. She had worn her better dress, a deep blue that he had not seen before, and her hair was up with the careful precision of someone who had decided that being taken seriously by a lawyer required a certain degree of presentation. They talked during the ride, and the conversation moved more freely than it had before, perhaps because of the night by the fire and the night of the rider at the gate, because something had changed in the architecture of their acquaintance, and neither of them was pretending it hadn't. She told him about growing up in San Antonio, her father's shop, the particular social world of a merchant family in a city that was still sorting out what it was after the Republic and before the full flood of American commerce. She had been educated at the city school and had wanted, at one point, to teach, but her father's illness had required her at home and then at the shop, and then his death had required her to survive, which took precedence over everything else. He told her about Missouri, about growing up on a farm outside of Independence, about his father who was taciturn and his mother who was not, about Caleb who had always been the easier brother. He told her about meeting Clara at a church social and knowing within the first 10 minutes that his life had just changed direction, the way a river changes when it hits new rock. He had not talked about Clara like that to anyone. He found that it did not hurt the way he expected it to. It was still sad, it would always be sad, but the sadness had a different quality when shared, less airless, less like a room with no windows. Jennie listened with the quality of attention that was her particular gift, full and real, the kind of listening that made a person feel genuinely heard. "She sounds like she was someone worth loving," she said when he had finished. "She was," he said. "She was very much herself. Strong opinions and a good laugh, and she could out-argue me on most subjects, which I respected even when it was inconvenient." Jennie smiled at that. "The hardest part," he said, "was knowing I did not get enough time with her. 3 years. I was just beginning to understand her. That is the cruelty of it, I think. You lose not just the person, but everything you would have learned." The wagon moved along the road. The sun was high and the land was very open. "I understand that," Jennie said quietly. "I think about the conversations I did not have with my father, things I assumed we had time for." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They arrived in Pecos in the early afternoon. Fletcher saw them promptly and was brisk and professional and thorough, exactly what you wanted in a lawyer in a situation like this. He took Jennie's sworn declaration and had it witnessed by 2 other men in the building, made copies of all the relevant documents, and composed a second, considerably more forceful letter to Webb's attorney that referenced specific statutes and the documented harassment, and which he said he would have sent by the morning's post. While Fletcher was finishing the paperwork, Ira went to the general store for supplies and also to the telegraph office, where he sent a wire to Caleb in Missouri asking specifically for any information available about Harlan Webb's past business dealings. On the way out of town, they stopped at a small restaurant, a simple place with wooden tables and a menu on a chalkboard, and Ira bought them both supper. They sat across from each other in a way that was, he was aware, recognizable as something a person outside looking in might identify as a couple having a meal together. And he found that this awareness did not produce the resistance he might have expected. It produced instead a complex mixture of feelings that he was getting better at not immediately suppressing. On the ride home, the stars began to appear, and they traveled the last hour by starlight, which in the high desert of West Texas was more than sufficient. She fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere in the last stretch of road, with the unconscious trust of someone who is very tired and has decided, beneath all the careful armor, that this is safe. He did not move. He drove the horses home through the starlight and did not move, and when the ranch came into view with the lamp still burning in the kitchen window where Devlin had left it, he felt something that he would not be able to name until much later, but that was the beginning of understanding that the wall was not just cracked. It was actively and completely failing. Caleb's response came 8 days later, forwarded from Pecos by Fletcher, who had picked it up at the telegraph office. It was concise and alarming. Harlan Webb had a pattern. In Abilene, in Wichita, in 2 other towns the Wire listed, he had identified vulnerable estates, made loans to people in difficult financial situations, and when the time came, called in the debt in ways that exceeded the actual obligation and left families with nothing. He had been investigated twice, and both times the investigations had gone nowhere. He had excellent attorneys and important friends, and he operated at the intersection of legal and predatory in a way that made him very difficult to challenge. He had also, according to Caleb's source, been accused by one woman in Wichita of threatening her directly when she refused to sign over property. The accusation had not gone anywhere either. Ira read this at the kitchen table and then looked up at Jennie, who was watching him. "Tell me," she said. He told her all of it. He watched her process it with that stillness of hers, the composure that was not absence of feeling but management of it. "He is more dangerous than I realized," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to be smarter than him." "Yes," Ira said again, and there was something in that yes, the two of them on the same side of the word, that felt very significant. "Could we file something with the county court? Something that makes any transfer of the land invalid without a court proceeding?" she asked. Ira looked at her with something that was approaching admiration. "I believe so. That is actually a good idea. I will write to Fletcher today." "Good." She stood. "I am going to make dinner." She went to the stove with the same calm purposefulness she brought to everything, and he watched her for a moment before picking up his pen, and thought that Caleb, whatever his methods, might have done the one genuinely right thing he had done in recent memory. Fletcher implemented Jennie's idea with efficiency and some enthusiasm, filing a legal notice with the Reeves County Court that established the land's status and required any disposition of it to go through a formal legal proceeding. This was a significant complication for Webb. It meant he could not simply lean on Jennie until she signed something. Any attempt to coerce a legal instrument would now be on the formal record. Webb's response came not by letter but in person. He arrived on a clear October morning, this time with his attorney, a man named Price, who carried himself with the practiced confidence of someone who charged more per hour than most people earned in a week. They came up the road on good horses and stopped at the yard, and Ira was standing on the porch when they arrived, which was not accidental. "Mr. Donnelly," Webb said. He had an easy manner now, the anger from the first visit carefully managed beneath a social surface. "I believe we have gotten off on the wrong foot. I would like to speak with Miss Dawson if she is available to see if we can resolve this matter amicably." "Miss Dawson's legal affairs are being handled by her attorney in Pecos," Ira said. "His name is Fletcher. I believe your attorney has his address." Webb smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "This has become unnecessarily formal. Miss Dawson's father and I had an understanding. The debt was significant and the estate was genuinely insufficient. The land grant resolves the matter cleanly. I am prepared to be generous with the terms of any agreement." "His understanding was with her father," Ira said, "not with her, and the land was registered in her name before any of your arrangements with her father. That is a matter of record now." Price said something quietly to Webb. Webb looked up at the house and then back at Ira. "She has made a friend," he said pleasantly. "I see." "She has a lawyer," Ira said, "which is the only relevant thing." Something moved in Webb's face. The pleasant manner held, but behind it there was something colder, a calculation being made that Ira did not like the shape of. "Tell her," Webb said, "that unresolved matters have a way of becoming uncomfortable." "I will tell her you called," Ira said. "Good day, Mr. Webb." Webb held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, then turned his horse and rode back down the road with his attorney following. Ira stood on the porch until they were out of sight, then turned and found Jennie standing in the doorway. She had heard everything. "He is not going to stop," she said. "Not yet," Ira agreed. That last thing he said, What does that mean? It means he is moving from legal pressure to something else. Ira came inside and shut the door. I want Devlin to sleep in the barn for the next few weeks and keep his rifle with him, and I want you to stay close to the house. She looked at him very directly. I am not going to be frightened into staying inside my own room, Ira. I know, he said. That is not what I am asking. I am asking you to be careful. She held his gaze for a moment. I know how to be careful, she said. I have been being careful since February. Then keep being careful, he said, and let me handle the parts I can handle. She nodded, and there was something between them in the middle of that exchange that was not just understanding. It was something more weighted than that, the specific feeling of two people who are in something together and have stopped pretending they are not. A week passed, then two. Fletcher received no further communication from Webb's attorney. The rider at the gate did not appear again. The surface quieted. Ira did not trust the quiet. He was right not to. On the 15th night after Webb's visit, he woke to the smell of smoke. He was up and out of bed in one motion, rifle in hand, door open. The smoke was not in the house. He crossed the yard at a run and saw the eastern barn, the smaller one where the hay was stored, beginning to show light at the boards. Not a full fire yet, just catching. Devlin, he shouted, running. Soto. Devlin was already at the barn door, awake and moving. Between the three of them, and with the water from the well and the water troughs and everything they had, they managed it. The fire took a portion of one wall and the corner of the hay but did not spread to the main structure. It took most of an hour, and by the end they were soaked and smoke-smelling, and Devlin had a burn on his left hand that Jennie cleaned and wrapped with competent care. In the morning, Ira walked the perimeter of the yard and found, on the far side of the eastern barn, boot prints in the soil near a patch of scorched ground. The fire had been set deliberately. It had been set as a message. He rode to Pecos and spoke to the county sheriff, a man named Aldridge who was familiar with the valley and its people, and who listened to the account with the tired professionalism of a man who had heard similar things before. Aldridge took down the information and said he would make inquiries. Ira did not place enormous faith in this, but making the report put everything on the official record, which was the important thing. He also sent a wire to Caleb with the full update, and Caleb wired back within 2 days with a name, a contact in Abilene who had had his own trouble with Webb, and who had told Caleb he would be willing to provide a sworn statement about Webb's methods if it would help build a case. Fletcher was very interested in this development. Ira and Jennie sat at the kitchen table that evening. The lamp between them and the statement drafts spread across the wood, and they worked through what they had. She was methodical about it, organizing the documents and the timeline with a precision that he had come to understand was characteristic. Her mind was organized and clear in a way that was genuinely useful. If Aldridge can connect the arson to Webb's man, she said, and if this contact in Abilene provides a statement, then Fletcher has a basis for a civil suit that could actually damage Webb's position and make pursuing you more costly than it's worth to him, Ira said. Yes. She looked at the papers. I want it to be over, she said simply and without drama, not because I am afraid, but because I am tired of my life being organized around him. I understand that, Ira said. She looked at him across the lamp. The light made her face very warm. You have given up a great deal for this, she said quietly. No, he said. You have, she insisted gently. Your solitude, your routine, your peace. You did not choose any of this. He was quiet for a moment. I have been rethinking, he said carefully, what I was choosing. She was very still. He was not practiced at this. He had been outside the territory of it for 6 years, and before that he had been younger, and the language had come differently, with less weight, before he knew what it meant to lose what you had set it to. He chose each word with care. When you arrived, he said, I thought you were a complication, something I had not asked for and did not need. I thought Caleb had overstepped, which he had, and that I would manage it politely and send you back within a week. He looked at the lamp rather than at her, then made himself look at her instead. I was wrong about all of that. I was wrong about what I needed. I was wrong about what solitude was actually doing for me, which was less protecting me and more preventing me from finding out that there was still something worth protecting in the first place. Jennie said nothing. Her eyes were very bright in the lamplight. "I am not saying this well," he said. "You are saying it perfectly well," she said very quietly. "I would like to know," he said, "whether you feel anything that is not simply gratitude or professional regard. Because I am aware that the situation has made things complicated and I do not want to assume, and I am also aware that you have a great deal happening and that you did not come here looking for Ira," she said. He stopped. "I have been trying very hard," she said, "not to fall in love with you. Because you were hurting and guarded and the situation was already complicated enough, and I was not sure you were ready and I was not sure I was ready." She paused. "I have not been entirely successful." The lamp burned between them. Outside, the canyon held its ancient and patient silence. He reached across the table and took her hand, and it was the simplest movement in the world, one hand crossing a lamplit table to meet another, and it carried everything 6 years of solitude had closed off, and everything two people with dark pasts and hard roads behind them had slowly and carefully begun to open. She turned her hand and held his. "This is complicated," she said. "Most things worth having are," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and it was the most beautiful thing he had heard in 6 years. They did not rush into anything. That was not who either of them was. But something fundamental had changed between them, acknowledged now, given words and breath, and the ranch moved through the following weeks with a different quality of light. Aldridge did connect the boot prints to a man who had been seen in the company of Webb's rider, a drifter named Cass Morley, who had a record of petty crimes, and who, when pressed by Aldridge with the specificity of the evidence available, offered information about who had hired him in exchange for a reduced charge. It was not a clean resolution, because Morley was exactly the kind of man Webb used precisely, because the chain between them was deniable. But it was enough that Aldridge was able to bring Webb in for a formal interview, and the interview was unpleasant enough for Webb that he had Price send a letter to Fletcher the following week. The letter was a retreat, dressed up in legal language that almost obscured the fact that it was a retreat. Webb was withdrawing his claim to the land grant based on a re-examination of the original registration documents. He was, Price's letter said with tremendous dignity, satisfied that the matter had been misapprehended and wished Miss Dawson well in her endeavors. Fletcher said it meant he had decided she was more trouble than the land was worth, and that the contact in Abilene and the arson investigation had tipped the calculation firmly against him. He expected Webb to find easier targets elsewhere and recommended they keep the court registration in place indefinitely as a precaution. Jennie read the letter at the kitchen table and then put it down and was quiet for a moment. "Is it truly over?" she asked. "I believe so," Ira said. "Fletcher believes so." She exhaled slowly, the long breath of someone setting down something very heavy. Then she picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in her satchel with the land grant document. 300 acres, she said. "My own land." "Your own land," he confirmed. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a conversation waiting in the space between them that they had been building toward for weeks now, and they both knew it was time. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "It is good land near the creek. I think cattle eventually, and perhaps a small structure while I build it up." She paused. "It would be more manageable if it were managed in conjunction with adjacent land." He looked at her very carefully. "Adjacent land like this ranch, for instance." "For instance," she said. "That would require," he said slowly, "a different kind of arrangement than a housekeeper and an employer." "Yes," she said, "it would." He stood up from the table and walked around it, which was 4 steps in the small kitchen, and felt like a much larger distance. And he stood in front of her and looked at her. This woman with her dark eyes and her quiet composure and her satchel full of documents and her 300 acres and her capacity for standing in the face of difficulty without losing herself. "Jennie Dawson," he said. I am a stubborn and solitary man with a history of grief and a serious difficulty accepting help from anyone. I am aware of my own shortcomings and I am prepared to work on them." He paused. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of agreeing to marry me?" She stood up. She was not quite as tall as him, and she looked up at him, and her expression was everything, every complicated layer of her, the intelligence and the warmth and the difficult year and the hope she had been carefully managing, and the things she had told him she had been trying not to feel and had failed. "Yes," she said, "I will." He kissed her, there in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the West Texas afternoon coming through the window, and it was the kind of kiss that is both an arrival and a beginning, both finally and only just now. They were married in December of 1884 in Pecos, at the small church on the main street, in a ceremony that was simple and real in the way that things are when both people are adults who know what they are doing and why. Fletcher witnessed the legal portion. Devlin and Soto were there, and they shook Ira's hand with the gruff warmth of men who had watched him be alone for a long time and were privately glad it was over. There was also a woman from the general store named Mrs. Hargrove who had befriended Jennie on the trips to town, and who wept happily and produced a cake from somewhere that nobody had asked for, and everyone was glad of. Caleb sent a letter from Missouri that arrived the week before the wedding, full of the particular tone of someone who knows they were right, and is trying very hard not to say so too obviously, and who was clearly delighted. He sent his love and said he intended to visit in the spring, and that he expected to be welcomed with significantly more hospitality than Jennie had received on arrival, and the reference to the rifle made Ira laugh for the first time in a very long time in a way that was completely uncomplicated. They rode back to the ranch on their wedding night through a cold December dark with the stars brilliant overhead, and the house was lit and warm because Devlin had left a fire going, and it was Ira's house, and it was Jennie's house, and it was theirs, which was a word that encompassed everything. They began working Jennie's land grant in the spring, which was ambitious, but they were both people who were constitutionally incapable of not doing things ambitiously. They hired a second hand for her parcel, a young man named Torres from the valley whose family had been in the region for 2 generations and who knew the land's particular qualities. They built a small working structure near the creek, dug an additional well, and began grazing a portion of Ira's cattle on the new land on a rotation that improved the yield on both properties. It was not easy. The work of a ranch never is, and combining 2 operations while figuring out the particular geography of a new marriage involved a continuous negotiation that was sometimes smooth and sometimes not. They disagreed about things with the genuine conviction of 2 strong-willed people, about the timing of the cattle sales and the priority of repairs, and whether the new well should be relocated slightly north. They worked through these disagreements in the way of people who had both learned the hard way that nothing was worth the cost of resentment, with directness and some heat and always, eventually, resolution. She was right about the well location. He told her so, and she received it without gloating, which he appreciated. Caleb arrived in April, as promised, on a horse borrowed from the livery in Pecos because he had come by stage and train, and was not a man who rode long distances if he could avoid it. He was 40 years old, rounder than Ira remembered, with the open face of a man who had always been easier in the world than his older brother, and he stood in the yard and looked at the ranch and then at Jennie and then at Ira, and he said, "You are welcome," before anyone had said thank you, which made Jennie laugh and Ira shake his head. Caleb stayed 2 weeks. He and Jennie liked each other immediately, with the ease of people who have a natural alignment of character, and watching them talk at the kitchen table gave Ira the specific pleasure of seeing 2 parts of his life fit together in a way he had not dared to anticipate. On the last evening of Caleb's visit, the brothers sat on the porch while Jennie was inside, and Caleb looked at the canyon and the stars coming up and said, without looking at Ira, Clara would have liked her. Ira was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "she would." "You are different," Caleb said, Not changed, different, the right kind of different, like you decided to be alive again. Ira did not respond to that directly. He said, "You should have told me what you were doing." You would have said no. Yes. I was right then, Caleb said, still looking at the stars. Do not make it a habit, Ira said. Caleb grinned. Jennie was with child by the summer of 1885, and the knowledge of it settled into the ranch with the deep and personal significance it carries when you are two people who had both known loss and had not entirely stopped fearing it. She was practical about the pregnancy in the way she was practical about everything. Finding a reliable midwife in the valley named Mrs. Becerra, a capable and experienced woman who visited monthly and whose calm authority was reassuring. Ira found that he was not able to be entirely practical about it. He found himself watching her more carefully, being more attentive to her comfort in ways that she occasionally found amusing, and she told him more than once that she was not made of glass, and that carrying a child was not an illness but a natural state of affairs that women had been managing since well before men began hovering. He tried to hover less. He was moderately successful. In the late September of 1885, their son was born in the bedroom of the ranch house, with Mrs. Becerra in attendance and Ira in the kitchen with his hands clasped and his jaw so tight that Devlin, who had been drafted into waiting outside with him, said nothing, and simply poured him a cup of coffee and handed it over in silence. When Mrs. Becerra came to the kitchen doorway and said he could come in now, he set the cup down so quickly it almost tipped. Jennie was pale and exhausted, and her hair was down around her shoulders, and she looked at him from the bed with an expression that held everything she was in it. The strength and the tenderness and the deep feeling that she had been offering him piece by piece since the morning she arrived with a satchel and that smile. In her arms was their son, red and small and making a determined fist at nothing in particular. Ira sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and something in him that had been braced against the world since 1878 released, quietly and completely, like a gate swung open after a very long time. "He needs a name," Jennie said. Ira looked at the boy. He thought about all the names that mattered to him and then said the one that was right. "Thomas," he said. "For your father," Jennie's eyes filled. She had told him about her father, about the specific quality of his patience and his pride in her, about how she missed him most on mornings when something good happened because he had always been the person she told good news to. She had not suggested the name herself. She did not need to. "Thomas Donnelly," she said. "Thomas Donnelly," he agreed. They wrote to Caleb. Caleb's reply, which arrived in 3 weeks, contained 3 pages of sentiments that became steadily less composed as the letter went on, and a list of suggestions for the boy's upbringing that Ira set aside with fond skepticism, and Jennie found entirely charming. The winter of 1885 was cold and requiring, the way West Texas winters could be when they decided to make their presence known, and they worked through it in the rhythm they had built over the past year, sharing the labor and the decisions and the evenings by the fire where Thomas slept in the cradle. Ira had built over 4 evenings in the barn, measuring twice and cutting once, and sanding everything smooth in the specific way of a man determined to do one particular thing without flaw. In the spring of 1886, they branded the first cattle from Jennie's land grant under the combined brand they had designed together. A simple mark that incorporated both their initials in a configuration that Ira had drawn on paper and Jennie had improved, and Torres had said was clean and would be easy to read at distance. They drove the first small herd to Pecos in April and received a fair price, and they came home on the wagon in the late light with the payment in Ira's jacket pocket and Thomas asleep between them. "We are doing well," Jennie said. "We are," Ira agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy, unconscious way she had now, no longer the exhausted sleep of a traveler but the chosen closeness of a woman at home. "I was thinking," she said. "That is generally a productive activity," he said. She elbowed him. Thomas did not wake. "I was thinking about the east pasture. If we put in another irrigation channel from the creek, we could run more cattle through the summer without the grazing becoming too sparse. He thought about it. She was right, which he had come to take as a fairly standard state of affairs. Tors said something similar in February, he said. Then Tors and I are both right, she said. You usually are, he said. It is occasionally annoying. She laughed, and Thomas stirred in his sleep and they both quieted automatically, and the wagon moved through the long West Texas evening toward home. They hired a third hand the following year, a young man of mixed Mexican and Anglo descent named Alvarado, who was 19 and capable, and who had the good sense to observe the way things worked on the Donnelly operation before offering opinions. He and Tors worked well together, and the ranch began to take on the character of a properly functioning enterprise, which was satisfying in the specific way that things are when you have built them from intention and labor. In 1887, their daughter was born in June, with the summer heat already established, and Mrs. Becerra in attendance again, and Ira in the kitchen again, and Devlin now so accustomed to this particular post that he had brought a book. The girl had Jennie's eyes and a quality of determined attention that was visible from her first week, and they named her Louisa, after Ira's mother, which was Jennie's suggestion, and which caused Ira to look at her for a long, quiet moment before nodding once. Thomas, at 20 months, regarded his sister with a combination of wariness and proprietary interest that Mrs. Becerra said was entirely characteristic of small boys in this situation, and within a week he had appointed himself her guardian, a role he took with an earnestness that was both touching and, occasionally, obstructive. Caleb came again in the autumn of 1887, this time with a woman, Eleanor, who he introduced with the slightly anxious formality of a man who is aware that he is bringing someone important to meet people who are important to him. Eleanor was calm and funny, and managed Caleb with an affectionate efficiency that Ira recognized immediately as exactly what Caleb needed. Jennie liked her before supper was finished. Ira approved of her before Caleb finished making the introduction. They were married the following spring, and Caleb wrote a letter of announcement that was possibly the happiest piece of writing Ira had ever received. The ranch grew through the late 1880s with the particular trajectory of something that has been well-founded and is now simply fulfilling its nature. They expanded the herd, improved the buildings, and put in the irrigation channel Jennie had suggested, which performed exactly as she had predicted. The combined operation of both land parcels, run as a unified thing under the Donnelly brand, had become known in the valley as one of the well-managed outfits in the region, which was the kind of reputation that accumulated slowly and through consistent behavior rather than dramatic event. There were difficult years, as there were on any ranch. A dry year in 1888 that required hard decisions about the herd size. A late frost in 1889 that damaged the garden Jennie had established behind the house and set them back on the kitchen stores. These things were managed, because difficult things were manageable when you faced them with someone you trusted completely. She was the person he talked to. About everything, about the ranch and the decisions and the occasional loneliness of leadership, and the large questions a person carries through a life. She talked to him in kind. The early careful silences of their first weeks had long since given way to a conversation that felt like it had no beginning and no planned end, just a continuous exchange between two people who were genuinely interested in each other's minds. One evening in the autumn of 1889, 5 years after Jennie had arrived at the ranch gate with her satchel and her smile, they sat on the porch after the children were in bed, the canyon dark before them, and the stars doing their usual extraordinary work overhead. A coyote called far off and was answered. "Do you remember," Jennie said, "the morning you pointed a rifle at me? I did not point it directly at you," he said. "You pointed it at the general vicinity of me," she said. "That is a meaningful distinction," she smiled. He could hear it in her voice. "You were terrifying," she said. "I was actually quite frightened." "You did not look frightened," he said. "I know," she said. I have a good face for frightened." He turned to look at her. The starlight was just enough to see by. "What made you stay?" he asked. "You could have assessed the situation and walked back down the road. No one would have blamed you." She was quiet for a moment, considering this seriously in the way she considered things. "You lowered the rifle," she said. "Not all the way, just an inch. And I thought, there is a man who is not as closed as he believes himself to be. There is a gap in this." She paused. "And I was very tired of running. I did not have anywhere else to go. And there was something about this place and about you, even in that first awful moment, that felt like something worth staying for." He reached across and took her hand, the lamplit table version of this gesture replaced now by the porch version, by the dark and the stars and 5 years of what they had built together. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "So am I," she said. The canyon held the silence the way it always had, old and enormous and indifferent, but they were not inside it alone. They were sitting on the edge of their life with the children asleep behind them and the land they had made there spreading out on both sides. And the grief that Ira had lived inside for 6 years was not gone, because grief for real things does not go completely, but it had become something that existed alongside everything else rather than instead of it, a part of his history rather than the whole of his present. He had loved Clara. He loved Jennie. These were not competing facts. They were simply both true, and the man who understood that was different from the man who had arrived in the Pecos Valley with only his pain and his determination, and the difference was standing right beside him with her hand in his. Thomas learned to ride at age 5 with the absorbed seriousness that characterized him, and he would grow up knowing this land the way only a person who was born to a place can know it, in his bones and his muscle memory, in the particular way he knew where the water ran after rain, and where the good grass was in the dry months. Louisa grew up with her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness, and a quality of her own that was neither of those things, a kind of clear-eyed joy that was her own particular gift to the world. In the spring of 1890, Jennie discovered she was with child again, and this time there was no anxiety in it, or much less of it, the anxiety of a third time being different from a first. She was 31 and in excellent health, and she took the news with the calm pleasure of someone receiving something they genuinely wanted. Their second son, Daniel, was born in December of 1890, and he was so loud about the process of being born that Devlin said from outside the kitchen that they could probably hear him in Pecos. Thomas, at 5, found Daniel deeply interesting in a way he had not found Louisa at first, and appointed himself a different kind of guardian for his brother, less protective and more instructional, which would characterize their relationship for the rest of their lives. Fletcher retired from his practice in Pecos in 1891 and sent a letter to Ira and Jennie on the occasion, a letter that was warm and spoke with genuine satisfaction of the Donnelly case as one of the better outcomes of his career. He wrote that it was gratifying, when a situation had involved real injustice and real risk, to see it resolved in favor of the people who deserved it. Ira read the letter aloud to Jennie at the kitchen table, and she pressed her lips together in the way she did when something moved her that she was not going to cry about. Harlan Webb, according to a brief and informative letter from Caleb's contact in Abilene, had left Texas entirely in 1889 and was rumored to have gone to Kansas, where, it was further rumored, his tactics had finally found their legal consequences. Ira told Jennie this, and she simply nodded and said she hoped whoever came after him in Kansas had a good lawyer. The land-grant land, by 1891, was fully integrated into the Donnelly operation and producing at a level that was fully self-sustaining, and then some. The 300 acres that had been a pressure and a threat and a contested document had become simply part of what they were building, part of the ground under their feet and the roof over their heads and the future they were making for Thomas and Louisa and Daniel. In the autumn of 1891, Ira rode out to the south fence one October morning, on one of the regular checks that kept a ranch in order. He rode the full perimeter of both properties, which took most of the day, and he came back as the sun was going down, the canyon catching the last of the light in shades of red and orange that were, after 13 years, still capable of surprising him. Jennie was on the porch when he rode in, and Thomas was beside her, and Louisa was chasing something through the yard that Ira could not immediately identify. Daniel was asleep inside, as he was for significant portions of the day at 10 months, which his older siblings considered something of a personal failing. He dismounted and handed the horse to Tors, who happened to be crossing the yard, and walked up to the porch and stood on the step below Jennie and looked at his family on the porch and the canyon behind and the sky above. And he felt something that was the accumulated weight of every decision that had led here. Every morning of solitude that had finally and decisively ended the morning she had walked up his road with a satchel and a smile and the nerve of someone who had decided that a rifle was not a sufficient reason to leave. "Good ride?" she asked. "The south fence needs work on the eastern section," he said. "Beyond that, everything is in order." Thomas said something about wanting to ride the south fence himself next time, at which Jennie said they would discuss it when he was older, at which Thomas began a negotiation that Jennie deflected with the practice of a woman who had been deflecting Thomas's negotiations for years. Ira sat down on the porch step and leaned against the railing and watched all of this with the particular pleasure of a man who has stopped needing to protect himself from life because life, at this particular point in time, is something he actively wants to be inside of. Jennie sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked out at the canyon going red in the sunset. "I was thinking," she said. "Again," he said. "The pasture to the north of the creek," she said. "If we ran the fence another quarter-mile, we could graze significantly more animals through the wet season." He thought about it. He could see the logic of it immediately. He also wanted to take a moment before agreeing because he had learned that if he agreed too quickly, she suspected he had not actually thought about it. "The north fence extension would require posts," he said. "Tors and Alvarado are busy through the end of the month." "December," she said. "I can help with the posts." "You have 3 children and a household to manage," he said. "I am aware," she said pleasantly. "I can also help with posts." He did not argue with this because she was right, she could. He said, "December then." "December," she agreed. The sun finished setting. The canyon went from red to purple to the particular deep dark that comes before the stars begin, and the stars came out over the Pecos Valley with their usual abundance, and Thomas had given up negotiating about the fence ride and was now lying on his back in the yard looking up, and Louisa had found whatever she was chasing and was examining it with a lantern she had retrieved from inside. "I want to write to Caleb," Ira said. "I have not written in a month." "Tell Eleanor we are thinking of them," Jennie said. "I will." Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses moved. The windmill turned slowly at the well. The night settled in around the ranch in the way nights did in the high desert, big and full and clear, and the world outside the fence lines was still wild and still hard, because 1891 in West Texas was still a place where things could go wrong quickly and often did. But inside the fence lines, in the light from the kitchen window and on the porch where they sat shoulder to shoulder, it was something else. It was home, not the solitary and defended thing Ira had built it as, the fortress of a man who had decided to stop expecting anything from the world. It was something larger and warmer and altogether more complicated, built out of a morning 6 years ago when a woman arrived at his yard with nothing but a leather satchel and a smile, and the complete refusal to be discouraged by a rifle. He had given up his solitude that morning. He had given it up more completely and more willingly with each passing week, until the solitude was not something he remembered missing so much as something he recognized had been a placeholder for what he actually needed, which was this, all of this, the life that was inconvenient and demanding and full of negotiation and children and partners and ranch hands and lawyers and cattle, and all the ordinary extraordinary difficulty of things that matter. "Ira," Jennie said. Yes, I am very happy. He turned and looked at her. The starlight and the kitchen window light between them, the dark canyon ahead. Thomas counting stars in the yard. Louisa now very interested in a frog. So am I, Ira said. He meant it with his whole self, the whole rebuilt self, the self that had arrived in this valley broken and had been, by work and time and one woman with a satchel and 300 acres and extraordinary patience, made into something it had not started out as but had clearly been capable of being all along. The stars turned overhead, slow and enormous, the way they always had and always would above the Pecos Valley. The night was cold and clear and alive with the sound of things moving in the dark, coyotes and wind and the creek, which did not stop for anything. And the ranch held its light against the dark, warm and specific and real, a place where two people had found each other and built a life that was large enough to hold their pasts and their present and everything they were still going to do.